Okay, we talked yesterday about Negroes and the New Deal, and we stated that Negroes did benefit from Roosevelt's programs, but the problem was they were in a lot worse shape because of discrimination in the workforce and housing than white people were. And so it was at this point in history, not in 1950s, with Rosa Parks, that Negroes became stimulated to fight for their rights, both legal rights and constitutional rights. And in many northern cities, black leaders would organize what we call Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns, and they boycotted places to purchase items in which they would not hire Negroes. We said in 1935 the National Negro Congress was established. It promoted the interests of black Americans within the New Deal agencies. And finally, two things pressured the President Roosevelt's administration to appoint prominent Negroes to federal positions in his administration, and one was the pressure that he got from the Negro Search for Equality, and the other was a push from his wife Eleanor, who thought he ought to do more for Negroes. And so he established, this is where we ended yesterday, he established an informal group of advisors that were black, obviously, that would be in the White House to give him suggestions, etc., on how to work with Negroes in America, and Roosevelt called that his Black Cabinet. Okay? Now, probably the most influential member of President Roosevelt's Black Cabinet was Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune. And I'll tell you a few things about her. She was an extraordinary person. Obviously, she was African American. I'm going to give you a few things about her and what she did during her life that kind of, in my opinion, made her maybe the Rosa Parks of the civil rights movement before we ever had a civil rights movement. Okay? First of all, she was an extraordinary educator, wonderful educator. She was a civil rights leader really before we had civil rights. Obviously, she was a government official because she worked close with President Roosevelt in the Black Cabinet. She also founded an organization called the National Council of Negro Women. The National Council of Negro Women. She even formed a college called Bethune-Cookman College, which is called Bethune-Cookman University now. And she did that in 1943. I mean, 10 years before we even really recognized the civil rights movement, which is to me extraordinary, that she was able to find or establish a college called Bethune-Cookman College, now Bethune-Cookman University, and she did that in 1943. She was a very esteemed political activist, that someone goes out in politics for different things, so to speak, very active in politics. Obviously, she was the first African-American woman to be involved in the White House, and she served 4 different presidents during her time. 4 different presidents. It didn't end with Roosevelt. So she was the first African-American woman to be involved in the White House, and she served 4 different American presidents. Her title is kind of interesting. Her title in the Black Cabinet during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, she served as, quote, race leader at large. That was her position. She was the race leader at large. What does that mean? Race leader at large. She's the leader of the Negro race. At large means you're the #1 honcho, so to speak, in that cause. So she was the race leader at large for the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Remember the National Youth Administration we talked about that gave money for youth students to earn money by making improvements, help clean up their schools and colleges? Well, she was the director of Negro Affairs in the NYA. She was the director of Negro Affairs. So she dealt with all Negroes that were part of the National Youth Administration. She was the director of Negro Affairs for the NYA. Finally, and I think a little bit late, but it happened in 1974, a statue was erected of her on park land in Washington, D.C. we'll get an opportunity, hopefully when we're there, to pay tribute to Mary McLeod Bethune by seeing the Bethune Memorial statue that's erected in Washington, D.C. So she's a very, very influential lady for black rights way before civil rights became an issue. Yeah.
What was the national thing for women that she funded?
National Council of Negro Women. So, what's another specific group of people that are going to need some help here by the New Deal? Farmers. And so that'll be our next subtopic, New Deal measures to help farmers in America. Now, I don't know how this compares to today, but when Franklin Roosevelt became president, 40% of American farmers or farms were mortgaged. What is mortgaged? They were paying on a mortgage. Like when you buy a house and you finance the house, then you have a mortgage. What's that? That makes sense? You have to pay it off. Okay? Now, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, farmers all over the country were faced with three serious financial problems. Okay? Farmers all across the country were faced with three serious financial problems. One was back taxes. What does that mean, back taxes? If you're owing back taxes, that means you're owing taxes back farther from what? The current year that, the past year that you're supposed to be filing. So when you file your income tax for 2016, if you owe back taxes, you did something, or didn't pay something back in 2000, now you're still paying those taxes with interest. So they owe for back taxes. Another financial issue farmers faced is the interest payments they were making. And that's what you pay for the privilege of borrowing money, interest payments. What do we call the paying back part of the loan? What are you paying on? That's the third thing they face troubles with. What's that? But it's called something. So when you when I make a payment on my house, part of the money goes to interest for my privilege to borrow the money, so the bank can, they don't borrow money for free because they got to make a living too. But what are you paying on? What do you want to pay down? Besides what? It starts with a P. Yeah. Principal. Okay. So farmers owed back taxes, they owed interest payments, and they owed principal on their loans. Now I want to explain what principal is. If I borrow $100,000 to buy a house, that $100,000 is the principal. And then if I have a 4% interest rate, the interest I pay to borrow that $100,000 is the interest rate. And I'm not a mathematician, but on a $100,000 house over 30 years, you might pay another $80,000 to borrow the money. I don't know, I'm not very good at that. But these farmers, what the problem was, is they couldn't pay their back taxes, they couldn't pay their interest payments, and they couldn't even pay their principal. So what happens when you can't pay those things? What? They take, who's they? They take your farm. The bank that lent you the money, or sometimes you get private mortgage companies that lend you money. Often banks, when you go to borrow money on a house, it won't be the bank that loans you the money. The bank will find a private mortgage company that pays them to get them the mortgage, right? And then so your private mortgage might be through someone that is affiliated with the bank, but the bank actually isn't loaning you the money in some cases. Okay, they offset it to somebody else. Well, what happens when farmers watch their farms taken over by banks and private mortgage holders or companies? They not only don't have any jobs, because that was their job, they don't have any, what? Anywhere to live, homes. So they become homeless and jobless, just like that. So when the farm's taken away, they lose their job and their home. Now, the federal government did not like the fact that these farmers were losing their property. So they made farmers loans at a very low interest rate to do one of two things. Okay, so if you were a farmer, you're in one of two shapes. You either were about to lose your farm because you can't afford to run it, or you lost your farm because you couldn't afford to pay for it. Okay? So what these low interest loans did from the New Deal is it gave money to farmers, and they could do one of the two following. If their farm was still operational, in other words, if they were still owning the farm, but if they were hurting, they could use the money to buy seed or fertilizer or equipment or whatever they needed to continue their farm, okay? In other words, they were making their payments, but they didn't have enough extra money to buy seed or to buy fertilizer or to buy equipment to farm it. They were just barely head above water owning the farm. They couldn't do anything to produce anything to continue paying. That's one way they could use the money. Another way is they could refinance those loans that they couldn't pay at the time of foreclosure. In other words, they'd go back to those banks and those mortgage companies. They would borrow the money from the federal government at a low interest rate and refinance. I'll give you an example of that. People do it all the time. I think I bought my first house 30 years ago and the interest rate was probably 8 or 9%. Anybody know what the interest rate on a house now is? About? Below 4. So a lot of people that borrowed money on houses at 9%, because the interest rate will eat you up, they refinance and go through a total credit check and refinance to get to that lower interest rate. Okay, and a lot of times to do that you have to have more money down or whatever. Okay, so what these farmers did that lost their farms is they went back to these banks and mortgage companies and said, hey, I want to remortgage, refinance. Do you think these banks and farms really want this property? Not necessarily. I mean, Gil McHenry's a banker. He borrows money for somebody to buy a $30,000 car, and the person makes 2 payments and quits, and Gil has to take the car back. Do you think he likes that? No, because that's what he's got to do. He's got to sell the car. And everybody's going to say, well, no, it's a brand new car. I made 2 payments. When you drive a car off the lot, I mean, you've lost half the value. So it isn't a positive thing for the bank. So if Gil McHenry repossessed a car after 2 payments, and all of a sudden that guy came back and said, hey, I found me some extra money, I'm going to refinance, you think he would do that? Sure he would, because he doesn't want the car. He wants, to continue to make this work. So that's what farmers did. So I'll give you an example. So let's say a farmer owed $5,000 on his farm back at this time. And he had a loan at 5%, and he had to repay it over 20 years. Because of the Depression, he couldn't do that. He couldn't afford a 5% loan over 20 years on a $5,000 mortgage. So what he does is he borrows $5,000 from the federal government under this new program, and he pays off his original loan. So he doesn't owe that anymore. And now he's paying 2.25% interest over 50 years. And can he afford to do that? Yes. So that's what this program did. It either gave farmers money so they could buy equipment and seed and fertilizer, etc., to run the farm they had not lost yet, or it gave them money to refinance, to borrow money from the government at a low interest rate and pay off that loan that they owed the other person. So now who do they owe? The government. But the government cut that interest rate in more than half, right? And gave them 30 more years to pay for it. So you take 5,000 divided by 20 years and 5,000 divided by 50 years and see the difference in payment. It's pretty easy to figure out. That's what we did. Now, that program for farmers was administered by the Farm Credit Administration, which was established in this country during the Roosevelt administration in 1933. And that's on your ID sheet. So this program that loaned money to farmers at low interest rates came from the Farm Credit Administration, which was established originally in 1933. But it was a savior for these farmers, an absolute savior. So we fixed up white working people, we fixed up black working people, we fixed up farmers. What other group needs help because they went down the toilet during the Depression? Banks, okay? So the New Deal now is going to have measures to aid the banking crisis in America. Okay, so we have a lot of banks that went belly up during the Depression, and President Roosevelt takes office. The banking business in the United States near total collapse, and so he had to fix it. Now I'm going to tell you my Ellen Durr story, because I've told you a lot of stories about my mother. My mother was born in 1917. So did she feel the Depression as a young child? Absolutely. I remember my mother, I'm not making this up, trusted banks so little that she had cash that she would wrap in cellophane, and then in, that metal paper, what's it called, aluminum foil, and put in the freezer in our basement in case she needed money for a rainy day. And that's what people were doing all across this country at this time. They all were withdrawing their money out of these banks even before some of them closed. They were putting it in mattresses, they were sticking it under floorboards, they were burying it in their yards so that they would know where their money was and safe. They dug up a bunch of gold coins out of a yard back east that somebody found in their yard. Millions of dollars worth of coins that they actually, it was a weird deal, they found that they actually belonged to the federal government. Somebody had stolen them, and so the people had to return them back to the federal government that they found buried in their yard. I bet you if you had a money-seeking machine that would go comb the yards, especially those in the east, I bet you'd be surprised how much money. Lance Millian, student body president, my first year in Roberts, 1998. Anybody seen the movie Secondhand Lions? Yeah. Well, anyway, Lance had two uncles exactly like those two guys. And they were old misers. They had a beautiful farm. They had a brand new house they had built on the farm and lived in two shacks. I mean, I'm serious. That's what they did. They didn't want to live in that new house. They felt guilty buying it. They misered every dime they had. When they died and left everything to Lance, Lance went into those shacks and those barns and buildings and started tearing wood apart in these old buildings and found money that his uncles had hoarded and put inside the walls of his barn, because they grew up during this time. And so it wasn't unusual. But you couldn't have that. You can't have people doing that. So not long after his inauguration, President Roosevelt declared what he called a bank holiday across the United States. Because he had to get this banking situation taken care of. People didn't trust banks at all. So not long after he was inaugurated into office, President Roosevelt declared what was known in history as a bank holiday. And basically what the bank holiday was is all banks across the country were closed for an indefinite period of time. He closed them all down. Okay, good ones and bad ones. Ones that had money in them and ones that were about to go belly up. He closed them all. Declared a bank holiday. Why did he do that? So people would quit pulling their money out. Because if everybody pulls their money out, we got no shock. So this action, this bank holiday, would prevent the American people from withdrawing their money until the president could work out a solution to the problem. Well, finally, President Roosevelt urged Congress to pass a new law to help with the banking crisis in the United States, and it was the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The Emergency Banking Relief Act. Now, I want you to think of why people would pull out their money. They'd pull out their money because they would be afraid that the bank didn't have sufficient cash to cover their deposits, right? So if I've got money in Pinnacle Bank and I think they're going down the toilet and they're losing money, I'm thinking, my God, they don't have enough money to give me if I want to get my money out of there. So I'm going to pull it out before they can tell me no. Well, what this did is it basically stated that only banks that could prove they had sufficient funds to cover their deposits or their depositors could open. If you could not prove that you had enough money in your bank to cover the money that people deposited, you could not reopen. Okay? So basically that Emergency Banking Relief Act established that banks could reopen for business only if they could prove to the federal government that they had sufficient funds to cover their depositors. Okay? Now, by this law, only sound banks would be permitted to open. Unsafe banks would have to be closed. Okay? Now, this basically forced banks that wanted to stay in business to make every effort to get financially sound or go what? Out of business. Okay? I just feel bad. I'm not sure the solution if you had your money in an unsound bank. Okay? But that's what he did. And so what he did is instead of having, compared, if you have a football team You'd almost rather have 35 kids that really want to play football than have 100 kids out there that could care less, right? And so you want the banks that are serious about the banking business out there, even if it's not that many, than to have 100 banks out there that are going to make people nervous. So that's what he did to solve the banking crisis, okay? Well, that'll take us to an election, a presidential election of 1936. Yes, my dear.
So the people that had their money in the banks that didn't reopen, they just
The bottom line was no, once they figured that out, it's a very good question, the government subsidized that. They helped them with that. Kind of like we bailed out all the car companies when the Obama administration took over. They paid money to Chrysler because they were bankrupt. The government helped those people who had money in banks that were not sound. Okay? Well, in June of 1936, the Democrat, without much hesitation, renominated President Roosevelt for the office of the presidency. The Republicans countered with a governor of Kansas by the name of Alfred Landon. Alfred Landon. And I mean, the Republicans made a run at the Democrats. They really made a run. And for the first time in history, you're going to see money trying to talk. And what I mean by that is you get in these political campaigns, I would hate to guess what Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are spending on this campaign. Millions, if not close to billions. You know what I mean? Well, in this particular election, the Republicans went crazy. They spent $9 million campaigning for Alfred Landon, compared to the $4 million that the Democratic Party spent on Roosevelt. So over twice as much. This was kind of unusual that they would spend that kind of money. So the Republicans spent $9 million campaigning for Landon in this election compared to the $4 million that was spent by the Democrats.